Chapter 9 The New Long March. In early September, all college students and the more revolutionary teachers and middle school students received permission to travel free throughout the country for what was called exchange of experiences. Within a short time, trains and buses were hopelessly crowded. At this point, a new phase began: long-distance walking. It was started by some students from the Dalian Shipping Institute in Manchuria who hiked all the way to Peking to visit revolutionary sites. Their journey was heralded as a way of young people to temper themselves and save the country money on transportation fees. Suddenly, it was as if China had been turned into a nation of soldier actors, at least so far as young people were concerned. We were to recreate for ourselves the hardships suffered by the Red Army more than 30 years before, either by marching as they had through the Jinggang Mountain and Ruijing district, where they fought their very first successful guerrilla wars against the KMT in 1934, or by following the 25,000 li route of the Long March, during which 300,000 men were reduced to 30,000, or by walking all the way from Yunnan to Peking, the road taken by our victorious troops in 1949. During all of this, we were to wear facsimiles of the coarse gray uniforms and straw sandals, carry heavy burdens as they had done, and travel at the forced march pace of an army at war. Since I was only 12, I would normally have had no chance to become involved in such things. But one day, the oldest son of the neighbors who shared our kitchen with us came home from Peking, where he was a composition student at the Central Institute of Music. Our families had always been very close, if only because of the Chinese custom of enjoying the cool on the hot summer nights. We'd often brought out our bamboo stools in front of the house together and chatted idly until the heat had dissipated enough to let us go to sleep. Peng Ming was about 8 years older than I, and had always been a person my sisters and I looked up to. He was confident, determined, brilliant, and a little hyperactive. His sentences poured out end to end, as if his mind worked much faster than his mouth could produce the sounds. When I heard he was home again, I felt the thrill of excitement a young boy can feel only when his hero is at hand. Peng Ming looked taller and bonier than ever, and he now wore thick glasses, perhaps a result of nighttime hours he had spent filing empty staves with revolutionary music. He was, of course, a Red Guard, and he soon proved that he knew more about everything than we did, including how to organize a new long march team. As he talked, he moved his long, thin arms as he would working magic, describing how we would walk from our doorway all the way to the very top of the Jinggang Mountain, 800 li away, about 240 miles. We would follow exactly in the Red Army's footsteps, suffering every hardship they had suffered, learning from them, turning ourselves into worthy inheritors of the torch of revolution by journeying to the very spots where it was first lit. Liang decided to go, and at last agreed to take me. When father approved, glad to get me safely out of the house again, I was in raptures. From then on, I would have died for the right to follow Peng Ming. There were 8 people on our team, including Peng Ming's younger brothers and sisters and several other neighbor children, all of them much older than I. We prepared for 3 days, learning how to fold our things inside our blankets in a neat little square of army green, how to tie our Red Army-style straw sandals and wrap our leggings around our calves. We prepared a red flag with yellow characters in imitation Chairman Mao calligraphy reading Long March, fitted placards on our bundles with quotations so the people walking behind us could see them and take inspiration, collected a first aid kit, a map, and canteens. My proudest moment was when Peng Ming pinned on my red armband, not a makeshift paper one, but one of finest red silk, with the shining snow-white words Red Guard painted onto it. Then he attached a beautiful Chairman Mao button to my jacket, a noble yellow profile with metallic red rays emanating from it, and Tiananmen Square in red relief below. I think I grew 10 inches. It was a beautiful, crisp winter morning when we set out through the gates of the Hunan Daily. The 8 of us in formation, Peng Ming's younger brother in the lead carrying our red flag. Father and the other parents saw us off, anxious but not regretful, proud but afraid to show their feelings before the small gathering of onlookers. Tears were controlled on my part as well, for I was determined not to show my age. I marched proudly and quickly without looking back even once. The people in the Changsha streets stared at us with respect and envy, and this made us walk even taller and faster. We had soon passed through the suburbs and entered the countryside itself. Within half a day, we began to encounter the new Long March teams, some from as far as Guangxi and Guangdong provinces, and I felt prouder than ever to be from Hunan, Chairman Mao's home province, and the fountainhead of the whole communist movement. Some of these other groups had better costumes than we, with real-grade uniforms and caps with red stars, and most of the teams were larger than ours. But our excitement and purpose were the same. We struck an instant camaraderie, singing songs together, encouraging each other, exchanging information about what lay ahead. The walls of the peasants' houses had been painted with slogans like "Only 750 li to the Jinggang Mountain" and "Revolution to the end." So we felt more than ever that we were all engaged in a common pilgrimage, that we were all part of an exalted tide being pulled inexorably towards some sacred moonlight. The peasants in the communes we passed through were warm providers. There were roadside stands where we could replenish our canteens with boiled water, and each commune had a major hospitality station where there was hot rice in huge wooden barrels, of which we could eat as much as we wanted free. There was never much in the way of meat or vegetables, but none of us complained, since it was our purpose to suffer the hardships of the Red Army. We were probably better off than them anyway, since at most stations there was a shelter in which rice straw beds has been spread for tired wayfarers, and the peasant women prepared hot water for washing and drinking. We must have depleted their stores and taken up an enormous amount of time. But the peasants seemed glad to make sacrifices for Chairman Mao and always urged us to eat more as if we were their own invited guests. Many of them already have small collections of buttons and printed slogans, souvenirs of the many groups who had passed before us. We covered most of Changsha County by the first night and stopped at a distinct hospitality station. It was an old Qing Dynasty meeting hall with a curved roof and eaves like the flip of the hair of a girl in the foreign movie. We soaked our blistered feet and crawled into bed 2 by 2, one person's blanket below and the others above. Our body heat raising the temperature in our cocoons enough above freezing to let us pass a comfortable night. We had walked closely to 8 li, 24 miles. The days passed and we soon got into a rhythm, sometimes climbing high mountains, where we could see the original slogans of revolution carved into the rock faces. We wanted land, they read, "Down with the landlords." There were pretty little pavilions where we could rest, and the forest rang with the cries of teams calling to each other. Liang and one of our other girls dropped back to walk with the team from Hubei province, but I kept up with the boys, although I often wept with the pain of blisters and exhaustion. Later, we began to follow the Red Army's custom of traveling at night, burning torches to light the way and walking until we were asleep on our feet. The more we suffered, the prouder we were, and some groups even bypassed the hospitality stations to sleep in the open and dig sweet potatoes from the peasants' fields with their bare hands. We saw the ditches where Chairman Mao had lain to fight the KMT, and the towns and villages were like museums, with the Red Army's meeting rooms, guns, sandals, and documents all preserved with faithful reverence. We could get precious Chairman Mao buttons at these sites, those invaluable souvenirs that had become national symbols of fervor and sincerity. Sometimes we were lucky and came upon some town square where an old graybeard, a member of the original Red Army, was speaking to the gathered Red Guards about his experiences in the liberation. The excitement of such times was tremendous. I had never felt closer to the glorious revolution, which had saved China from 1,000 evils. When Peng Ming stopped our team once so we could carve our names onto a thick bamboo, I took the knife and cut as deeply and as beautifully as I could. I did find one thing strange, though, to judge by the old slogans and by what the revolutionaries had to say. The peasants seemed to have been more interested in getting land for themselves than in communism or socialism. I realized, too, that if they had understood so little about the goals of liberation, they understood even less about the Cultural Revolution. They were treating us so warmly because they adored Chairman Mao for driving out the landlords, and he had told them to welcome us. But they really didn't seem to know why we were there or what was happening in the cities. Nor did they really seem to care. This was a little disturbing to me. We were struggling to develop communist thought and ideals, while it seemed as though they had been selfish and materialistic. And for so many years, we had been taught about our great socialist peasant liberation. After 4 days, we descended from the mountains and came to the large city of Pingxiang in Jiangxi province. From its appearance at night, it was nearly as big as Changsha. The time was after midnight. It was raining gently, and we had walked nearly 100 li that day, but our rest was not to come easily. Throughout Hunan province, we had been given excellent treatment, but when we crossed the provincial border, the numbers of Red Guards increased far beyond the peasants' capacity to accommodate them. In Pingxiang, every hotel and hospitality station was filled with pilgrims, all sleeping on the floors like rows of wrapped dumplings. With no place else to try, we were told that the only space available in the last hospitality station was the corridor, which was already wet with rainwater. In our innocence, we Changshanese would probably have slept in the muck without too much complaint. However, we were traveling with 2 more experienced teams, and Peng Ming, as a pecking Red Guard, was accustomed to respectful treatment and getting his way. An argument developed, with Peng Ming and the others accusing the station workers of failing to support the Red Guard movement, and the workers protesting that there simply wasn't another inch of space to be had. The ruckus aroused the sleepers, and they all came to our defense. Pretty soon, the whole hospitality station was involved in what promised to be a major incident. It was then that Peng Ming decided to make me his prime exhibit. "Look at this child," he said, putting his arm around me, a 12-year-old boy, wet to the skin, exhausted, but driven by his revolutionary commitment to surpass his own physical limits. "Look, he's already got a cold." It was true, my nose was running uncontrollably. "But he doesn't complain. But you would make this child, this seedling of the revolution, sleep in the cement corridor, in the rainwater." There was a murmur of general sympathy, and many cries for, "Here, young fellow, sleep in my bed," and "Here's a towel and a dry sweater, take these." But I stood in embarrassment beside Peng Ming, too overwhelmed by all the attention to want to leave his side. The workers still refused to give in. However, and finally, Peng Ming and the others proclaimed a hunger strike. We all sat down in the office and refused to move. This was to tell the inhabitants of Jiangxi province that the hospitality station was undermining the Cultural Revolution. The rain beat on the roof, and slogan-chanting faces flickered in the light of kerosene lanterns. Our wet clothing gave off a musty smell like mildew. My eyes were stinging with exhaustion, and my body ached all over. I think I could have fallen asleep sitting right here on the office floor. This was my first experience with confrontation tactics, and it was short and sweet. The workers hastily yielded us in their offices 2 large rooms, and we spread our things wherever there was space for a body, on the floors, on the chairs, and on the desks themselves, piling stacks of documents onto one disordered mountain. Victory warmed our dreams, and the next day the local Red Guard newspaper criticized the workers, saying that their lack of hospitality was a question of a proletarian revolutionary feeling. They also said that everyone should learn from the youngest Red Guard ever to visit the city, their 12-year-old comrade in arms from Hunan, who struggled as resolutely as his older teammates, never fearing hardship and always placing others before himself. As we left Pingxiang, Liang wiped my runny nose for me with a handkerchief and commented dryly, "You're Red Guard now. Red Guard blows their noses." The next part of our journey took us back up to the Luoxiao Range, to the historic village of Sanwan, the site of the famous Sanwan reorganization in 1929, during which the party had first been placed in absolute command of the Red Army. We climbed with ever greater eagerness, pulling ourselves up by the long branches that hung down like ropes, choosing the hardest routes near the cliff faces, scrambling on all fours amid the rocks and boulders. We arrived in early evening, exhausted and triumphant, with very empty bellies. Along the road, we had seen a lot of notices urging Red Guards not to stay the night in Sanwan, but to press on, because it was only a small production team of several hundred peasants, and they didn't have the facilities to handle many of us. However, such notices were useless, since almost everyone wanted to stay at the revolutionary site. The place was filled with red armbands, and the peasants were boiling rice frantically, never enough to meet the demand. Every time a pot was finished, the Red Guards squeezed around, pushing and shoving, the camaraderie we had experienced earlier in the trip forgotten in the need to get something to eat. I was still smaller than most, and I had a green cap that I had gotten from one of the old revolutionaries in exchange for one of the precious Chairman Mao buttons I was acquiring at each historical site. I stacked my way in through the thickest of legs and emerged in the center by the pot with my cap outstretched, receiving a hot hatful of rice from a harried peasant woman. I escaped proudly back to my teammates with my booty, and we ate from the dirty cap with our hands. Hygiene was the last of our concerns. The next problem was housing, and Peng Ming thought of a clever way to make use of his musical talent. He spent a few minutes composing simple movements to accompany the songs he had taught us on the road, and rehearsed us for half an hour. Then he announced that we would be holding a performance for the Sanwan peasants on the threshing ground. Crude as the show was, the peasants loved it, for Sanwan was a culture-forsaken place, and several members of our team had decent singing voice. When we volunteered to teach the peasants some of the songs, they began to regard us as windfalls from heaven. From there, it was a simple step to an invitation to spend the night as guests in their houses, and we trooped off 2 by 2. The houses were wooden and had 2 floors, very different from the sturdy, sprawling mud brick homes of Hunan. The second floor was made simply of planks laid crosswise over the structural logs, uneven enough that you would see much of the floor below through the cracks, unstable enough that an unwary footstep would lift a plank and send you crashing right through the floor. This is exactly what happened, and I landed in a pile of brushwood on the floor below, my face scratched and bloody. I was more breathless than hurt. Our peasant hosts were in a panic that I was injured, and I was worried that I had broken their house. But when Peng Ming poked his head down through the floor from above and his glasses joined me in the brushwood, everyone laughed. Going aloft again, I was more careful, managed to find myself a comparatively solid stretch aboard, and I was soon fast asleep. After Sanwan, the mountains were higher, and at times we looked down into swirling clouds and fancied ourselves in fairyland on a floating archipelago. There were fewer trees, most of them piney and gnarled, and the air was full of frost and moisture, coating the rocks with slippery ice and giving us all a hoary look of a premature age. I was soon covered with cuts and bruises from my falls. Fortunately, Father had insisted us that we bring army sneakers and the white gauze face masks, worn for protection during cold, dry weather. So we were able to discard our straw sandals and warm our frozen mouths and noses. It seemed our urgency increased the nearer we came to our goal, and we were traveling almost at a trot when the road permitted. I thought it strange the way our fingers and toes felt like ice while we sweated so much that our clothing was wet. There were two major landmarks on the Jinggang Mountain, one the Mao Flatland and the other the Ci Flatland. The second was higher and had been the major communist place. Most Red Guards spent the night at the Mao Flatland, resting in preparation for their ascent to Ci Flatland. But like people with an obsession, we decided to continue without stopping. A loosely formed group of about 20, we marched through the night until we didn't have the strength to sing, and there was only the sound of many footsteps crushing dry twigs. Finally, a long distance away, we saw the glimmer of lights, and we knew we had reached our destination, the final stop in our 800-li quest. I don't know how we made it to the rest of the way, but the lights got bigger and bigger until at last they turned into the biggest surprise of our trip, a group of 5 ultra-modern multi-story government buildings, every bit as fancy as the Hunan Hotel in the Changsha Martyrs Park. Perhaps Chairman Mao had built them in memory of his guerrilla days and used them for top-level secret meetings. Now they were packed with Red Guards, and with sleep already a film over our eyes, we were assigned to the back of a stairwell where there was fresh rice grass and enough space for the 8 of us from Hunan if we doubled up into 4 cocoons, 2 of girls and 2 of boys. The next day we saw how clever Chairman Mao was to choose the Ci Flatland at his base. It was ringed all around with sharp peaks, each of which would be as difficult to cross as the one on which we had just expended our final strength. It was a pretty area, and would be fertile enough in the summertime with all the mountain streams and good brown land, but now it was poor and barren, and the peasants had no task but to stare at the newcomers. There were so many Red Guards that the streets were running with them, and more were streaming down from the mountainsides every moment. I suppose somebody should have known that the flatland would become a disaster area. But there was no sign that anyone had foreseen the consequences of sending a nation of young pilgrims to a few square miles of wintry land on one of the most rugged mountains in China. Our troubles began that morning. Peng Ming suddenly ran to the outside and came back half an hour later, looking green and yellow and holding his stomach. He lay down on the straw and couldn't get up again. 2 of the girls were sick too. When I went with them to the clinic, we found that there was an epidemic, and the clinic was full. There would be rice porridge available for the ill twice a day, while everyone else would be eating boiled sorghum. It was a real nightmare. Our leader was helpless, and still more young people poured down like red ants, triumphant and excited, then sober and worried when they learned of the illness and the food shortage. And then the worst thing possible happened. It snowed. It came down in thick, obstructing flakes, the winds blowing it off the slopes and filling the bottom of the huge bowl we were in. It continued for an interminable 3 hours, and when it stopped, a light blanket of snow had blown through the window to cover Peng Ming where he lay. Liang Fang's hands were frozen to a strange red color. It was frightening and beautiful. Snow in Changsha never came this white and thick. Then, in the perfect silence of snow, I heard a strange sound like a distant tractor or a nearby fly, and a small helicopter emerged from behind one of the mountains and hovered above us, then descended cautiously lower and lower over a field. We all ran out in the snow, waving our hands and nearly weeping with happiness, shouting, "Chairman Mao will save us! Long live Chairman Mao!" Then the boxes began to drop, big square ones with parachutes, settling with a sigh into the snow. At first, people ran everywhere at once, as if trying to get a box for themselves. Organization soon prevailed, however, and the boxes were carried to the central hospitality station to be apportioned. Soon, we heard we were to line up, either bringing our identification cards or sending them with a team representative. Liang took my primary school photo of me in my young pioneer scarf, with the others' middle school and college IDs, and went to stand in line. She returned in an hour with a small bag of biscuits and 2 pieces of hard candy for each of us, and the news that the Tsu Flatland was being evacuated because of the pandemic. The next day, army trucks would be coming up the paved road to ferry us all to a place called Jian Country, where we could be put on trains and sent home. Teams with illness would have priority over others, so we would be among the first to go. We heard the news with a mixture of relief and regret. We were miserably uncomfortable and worried about our sick comrades, but this seemed to be an abrupt and inglorious ending to our revolutionary travel. During the whole journey, we have regarded physical discomfort as a welcome test, always remembering that it was nothing compared with what Red Army had suffered. In all the 10 days of our new long march, I had never heard anyone complain about his struggle with nature. I have never been so cold or hungry in my life, yet if someone had given me a choice about going down in an army truck or walking, the decision would not have been an easy one. So Liang announcement took us by surprise, although we realized sadly that evacuation was the only solution. The trucks came early in the morning, almost 100 of them, and the soldiers packed all us in, 30 or 40 to a truck. It was a beautiful sunny morning, and the snow was melting, but we were too weak to enjoy it. Even our proud flag seemed to have gone limp. I stood by Peng Ming holding a blanket around us, and the girls leaned against each other with their arms entwined, their hair matted, and their hands still that strange red. The road twisted back and forth like an active snake, which didn't make us much more comfortable. Peng Ming's brother threw up twice and Liang 3 times. The descent seemed to last forever. 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, but finally the road straightened and quickened, and we began to notice army trucks coming back for a second load. We were in Jian County, but we were half dead. We were luckier than we knew, however, for within a week meningitis broke out on the mountain. I've heard that the monument listing the names of the hundreds of Red Guards who died there stands over 10 feet high. The difficulty